So how did I get interested in the witchcraft panic in Northern Ireland? That would have been through reading the Sunday News at the beginning of August 1973. Front page headline, Witchcraft on the Copeland Islands or something along those lines. And it's an incredibly lurid story. But as a would-be anthropologist, an undergraduate at the time, it tweaked my interests, and I began to pay attention as other news stories appeared in other local papers in the autumn of '73. That's how I got interested. It was simply interesting.
Could you just quickly explain who Brian McDermott was and what happened to him and how that's kind of coloured the whole witchcraft scare?
So you want to know, so what was the role really of the Brian McDermott killing in all of this?
Yeah.
Well, where to start really? To return to something I've already talked about, it was a very strange time in the North. People were getting assassinated almost on a daily basis. Catholics actually mainly were getting assassinated on an almost daily basis. So murder and bloody murder, and sometimes very vicious bloody murder, wasn't anything strange or startling. I know that sounds a terribly callous thing to say, but it was part of what was going on. The murder of a 9-year-old, the abduction and dismemberment, and the abduction, murder and dismemberment of a 9-year-old was something beyond the pale and was widely seen locally as being beyond the pale. And this, I laugh, but it's not funny because it would suggest there was a kind of all these bloody murders that were going on were within the pale, and then it took the killing of a 9-year-old to sort of make people sit up and pay attention. But there is a degree of truth in that, I'm afraid. It will be true to say that by late 1973, people in Northern Ireland had become inured to an almost daily diet of savagery. And if you read the Dennis and Lehane book on political murder in Northern Ireland, which I do recommend, which was written at the time, and it has all the hallmarks of a very quick piece of investigative journalism. There are mistakes in it. But nonetheless, it does paint a basically accurate picture of an organised campaign of sectarian assassination, some of which wasn't just a bullet through the head, some of which was torture, mutilation, using knives and blades and things like that. But this was different. And what happened was he went to play, it's the beginning of September, went to play in the Ormeau Park and didn't come home. And found his body, I think, approximately a week later perhaps, in the river, or the remains of his body in the river. And it had been butchered, literally, and burned, presumably in an attempt to hide, to get rid of the evidence or whatever. And immediately, on the back of the Copeland Island rumours, and perhaps something else as well, which we can come to, people began to speculate, was this a black magic killing? And I think one of the reasons they did so was because it was beyond the pale. It was not within the normal rules of violent political engagement at that time, as there were in Northern Ireland. I don't mean in saying that to trivialise what was going on, because it was anything but trivial. It's truly, truly vile. But this was something different. And that killing, for whom they've yet to actually find a murderer, although there's a kind of a public knowledge about who did do it, and that it wasn't a sectarian or a witchcraft killing. But that murder set up a whole trail of speculation, and it figures quite consistently in some of the more lurid things that were being said in the press about witchcraft and black magic. And it certainly contributed towards one of the threads in the rumours and fears that autumn, which was that Satanists were looking for children to abduct. So the role of it really can't be underplayed. I think, I think it may be the longest standing open murder case in Northern Ireland, I think. Several times the police have got close to charging somebody, and several times it hasn't happened. That's my understanding anyway, and I think that's in the public domain.
To go more on the theoretical side, because I think you mentioned some interesting things in terms of that. I'm right to assume that in your book you say it was more the Protestant paramilitaries that were targeted by the witchcraft scare rather than Catholic paramilitaries.
Well, I think it was the Protestant population more than the Catholic population.
Yeah.
Although the Ardoyne is a Catholic enclave, so they it would have worked, particularly since the ground had already been prepared, so to speak, by local superstitious beliefs and stuff. But my understanding from Colin Wallace is that they were particularly interested in getting at the Protestant population and getting them to believe in this stuff. And I think there are a number of reasons why. One is that Colin Wallace himself is a Northern Irish Protestant. It's a community he knew very well. And secondly, I think the nature of Protestantism probably leaves itself more open to believing that kind of stuff than Catholics might. Now that's a complicated can of worms, but yeah, that would be my belief. And if you look at the spread of the stuff, if you look, for example, at what happened in Banbridge, there was a Protestant gospel campaign in Banbridge that autumn of '73. And it's quite clear from the local press coverage of it, which is quite extensive actually, that one of the themes that was explored and drawn upon by the preachers was the sudden appearance in the midst of the God-fearing Protestant community of these kinds of dreadful things. I think the nature of folk belief, if you start with folk belief, the Protestant Catholic communities had and still have a certain amount in common when it comes to that. I grew up in a Protestant area of East Antrim, and there were people who believed in the fairies or said they did, and what have you. But what you also have in the Protestant community is a whole set of other stuff about the devil. The devil looms much, much larger in what you might call the belief cosmology of Northern Irish Protestants. It certainly did then. I think things have changed subsequently and doubtless changed for the better. But the devil and his works, to quote Dennis Wheatley, was certainly something that Protestants worried about more than Catholics. And I think that one of the reasons for this has to do with the fact that Protestants, in a sense, are or were less well protected by saints and priests, and it's a different kind of belief system where you're, in a sense, you're kind of on your own, vulnerable to the lures, traps and snares of the devil. And I just think that he knew what he was doing. He knew his target audience very well. And the Catholic community was being targeted with other stuff, but also the Catholic community was more, I think, better protected against what, for want of a better word, I can only call British Army stuff, by virtue of their great hostility towards, than the Protestant community was, because the Protestant community, parts of it were in open conflict with the British state, but in fact they saw themselves as part of the British state, so they were in a much more contradictory, ambiguous and vulnerable position, I think. So I do think that there is something to be said about the difference in the belief systems involved, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because one of the things that we're kind of exploring in the documentary is kind of this idea of fake news. So I'm just wondering what role that, you explained this quite well enough, the role that so-called experts played that were actually quoted anonymously.
Well, experts. But before we go on to that, the Copeland Island story, I think, is a mysterious one. There's a mysterious person who let the USPCA know about it, and they didn't apparently record his name. So that's a bit strange. And then but they knew who they were informing, because that particular USPCA inspector was a man who was in the headlines quite a lot. He was, if you like, a self-promoting campaigner, and not actually very well liked within the Ulster Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals at the time. And I've spoken to other inspectors from other areas who just thought it was a load of nonsense. But he played the story up to Des Eakin, the journalist from the Sunday News. And Des Eakin then went and spoke to a person who he refused to identify to me. But it didn't take too much local knowledge to identify the person. And that person was a woman called Sheila Sinclair. That's her stage name, by the way. It's not her real name, but it was the name she wrote under and lectured under and spoke to the newspapers under. Oops. And she basically promoted herself as an expert on the other world, the supernatural, folk belief, all kinds of stuff. And she did speak to Des Eakin. But what was interesting about that is I think she panicked a little bit, perhaps. And she insisted that he did not use her name. So the expert in that story is not named. She did, however, emerge in a couple of other stories, and I did manage to interview her in her declining years. And it seems that she was one of the primary local sources of expert information about this kind of thing, which speaks to the poverty of, or rather not poverty, it's not the right word really, the careless gullibility of local journalism at the time. Because actually she was a jolly good writer and a jolly good reteller of folk stories and folk beliefs, and an engaging lecturer. I mean, I saw her at the time, but you couldn't have called her an expert, not by anybody's stretch of the imagination. There are other anonymous experts that emerged occasionally in stories at the time, who I've not been able to identify. Colin himself may have occasionally posed as something of an expert, because little knowledge being a dangerous thing. He had done some homework, but once again, that's not clear. But what's interesting is the consistent use of supposedly expert testimony to legitimate or validate rather lurid stories. And what's interesting is that even when the expert in question is debunking the stories, it still kind of gets turned around. And that happened to one of my lecturers, and it was my fault. The chap who taught me, Jim Moody, who taught me about the anthropology of witchcraft, because it's quite a specialist subfield within anthropology. I, to my great mistake, put him in touch with a local journalist who wanted an expert, and what subsequently happened, well, I did get a bollocking for it, because it became very sensationalized, and even though he was actually debunking the stories, or rather, he was more interested in talking about rumour and the role of rumour in amplifying conflict. It came out rather as something else in the hands of my mate, the journalist. And I'm not sure Jim ever forgave me for it, and if I'd been him, I'm not sure I would have done either. Although, having said that, he should probably have known what he was doing in dealing with local journalists. And it's one of the reasons why it took me a very long time to write that book, because I was very reluctant to become seen to be a local expert, and I still am. Because the role of the expert in legitimating fake news, as it's now called, should not be underestimated. The role, for example, you see it in the States all the time, of various right-wing think tanks and people who set themselves up as authorities on subjects being used to legitimate things. And you saw it during the Brexit campaign, I think, as well. So, I mean, Michael Gove might have believed that we don't want anything more to do with experts, but Michael Gove's wrong about that and many other things, because expert knowledge, if a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, expert knowledge can be an even more dangerous thing, because it can be manipulated and misquoted and mishandled and used to prop up stuff that the expert in question wouldn't dream of legitimating or validating in a month of Sundays. So the role of expert testimony, it's not the most important part of the thing, but it gives you an interesting insight into how supposedly expert knowledge can be used, point one, and point two, how supposedly expert knowledge is often anything but that. It's often people who claim to be experts, but who don't actually have much in the way of expert knowledge. And that, I think, was the case with Sheila St. Clair. She was a raconteur, she was a storyteller, and a very entertaining one who wrote interesting books. And she's much more reliable on the printed page than she was when she was being consulted by journalists. She may have been flattered to be consulted. Oh, excuse me. That's one of the reasons I don't like being interviewed, one's voice. She may have been flattered, Sheila St. Clair, to have been consulted. But in several cases, she certainly did provide testimony which shored up stuff that ultimately, when you start to pick it to pieces, the expert testimony is, well, they could have, and they might have, and they would have, and etc., but it doesn't actually tell you anything. And it's not to be relied on, which is why I don't offer myself in this venue as an expert.
When you first met Colin, did you have any doubts on whether he was genuine or not? Or
Well, I'd read Paul Foot's book and had enough respect for Paul Foot's journalism to think that there was at least here some sort of dirty tricks thing, of which Colin Wallace was the victim as much as anything else, by the way.
Mm.
But apropos anything else, I pitched up on Colin Wallace's doorstep, not in a frame of mind of hostility at all. No, quite the reverse. Because, I knew something of his concerns to try and bring the Concora mess into the light of day, and I admired that. But I also knew that I was dealing with somebody who was an ex-member of a professional community of professional liars, i.e. British Army intelligence. So I was quite prepared to be misled, shall we say. And I took various precautions, and I told Colin, I'm not telling you anything I didn't tell him at the time, pretty much. I didn't tell him what I knew. I just told him, I'm interested in what's in that book, in the Paul Foot book, can you tell me more about it? I didn't tell him anything about what I knew. And when we'd more or less exhausted his spontaneous telling me of what he knew and my probing of it, I then told him what I knew, and I showed him my press cuttings, of which I had a huge set of notes at this stage, and I told him what I knew, and some of which appeared to be new to him. And I came away with the impression that whatever else had happened, I had not been on the receiving end of somebody who was trying to bamboozle me. I came away with the impression of somebody who was trying to do his best to tell me what he knew with as much honesty as possible. And I have several reasons for that judgment. The first is simply talking to the man himself. you have to rely on your sense of who it is you're talking to. And I've done an awful lot of interviews of people by this stage, and my sense of who I was talking to was basically an honest man. Secondly, he was honest enough when he couldn't remember something to tell me. Thirdly, his account is littered with inconsistencies and a few contradictions, which is exactly what you might imagine of somebody who's trying to remember something that happened 20 years earlier in the middle of an awful lot of other stuff, which is possibly more important, and who doesn't have a set of notes in front of him. Now, those factors taken together lead me to believe that he's a plausible and trustworthy witness. That doesn't mean he's reliable in the sense that he did forget some things. He did get some things a bit wrong, but he got sufficient right. Now, this could have been a man accustomed to misleading people delivering a really impressive performance. But it would probably have to be the best such performance that I would ever have seen. And I don't think it was that. So I came away believing that basically what he said was what he thought and believed to be true, and that he wasn't trying to mislead me. I've had no reasons subsequently to think anything else.
And finally, we had a quick discussion outside about both Fred and Colin, their ideas of corruption in high places and in wealthy individuals. And you said something, and now I can't remember what it was.
Oh, I said about, what you're asking me about here is the role of a set of ideas about rich, upper class, possibly aristocratic Satanists. Yes. That's what you want to know about,
yes. Which
Colin did talk about. And that's a very old belief, actually. It comes at its most accomplished in the work of Dennis Wheatley, the novelist and occult expert, who was probably the first introduction that many of us had to notions of Satanism. And this image of the corrupt aristocracy, the corrupt elite who are engaged in black magic, sex, possibly child abuse, all kinds of stuff, is a very long established image. It goes all the way back to the early modern period and the witchcraft persecutions, and similar things were said about the Jews in medieval times. And if you look at the satanic ritual abuse scares that occurred in the US in the 80s and the 90s, some of which spread over to Britain, it's also a very consistent theme in them, that there is this incredibly powerful conspiracy of Satanists who are full of influential people, politicians, etc. If you think about the recent child abuse accusations which are currently being tried, not the abuse accusations, but there's Nick, who made a whole series of accusations about prominent politicians and things, which has all vanished into Mr. Nonsense, and who's now himself being prosecuted for all of this. This is a very old belief. Now, there are two reasons why it might be an old belief. One is that it's true. Well, if it had been true, the bodies would never be emerged. And the answer to that is, of course, but they're so powerful they cover it up. It's not really very convincing. It's not really very convincing. I think a better reason is that, once again, these kinds of beliefs often get entangled with conflicts and schisms within society. And people get accused of this stuff unfairly and unjustly.